Our speaker today, Brenton Simons, is going to be talking about his new book, Witches, Rakes, and Rogues, True Stories of Scam, Scandal, Murder, and Mayhem in Boston, 1630 to 1775. Mr. Simons is Chief Operating Officer at the New England Historic Genealogical Society in Boston, and he's also the author of The Langhorns of Langhorne Park and co-editor of The Art of Family, Genealogical Artifacts in New England. And please help me welcome Brenton Simons. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I heard something on television some months ago that I think you'll recognize, and when I heard it, I thought, I can really use that statement. It's a bit convoluted, but I think you'll recognize it. Quote, reports that say something hasn't happened are always interesting to me, because we know there are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know, but there are also unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know we don't know. That was Donald Rumsfeld, and of course you know he was speaking about the Iraq War, but to me he was speaking to the early colonial history of Boston. In putting together a collection of stories about early Boston, I realized there were a lot of unknown unknowns and known unknowns. And many of them are ones that happen to change our perceptions about Boston as a prim and proper town. And there's one that I especially like, and it goes something like this. In, quote, in New England, a hectoring debauchee resided in Boston, where too many of the same stamp have lately multiplied. Strolling upon a road, the debauched gentleman encountered an honest, ingenious countryman. He offered the countryman some startling news. Quote, the devil is dead. How? Said the countryman. I believe not that. Yes, said the other, he is dead for certain. Well then, said the countryman, if the devil be dead, he has left many fatherless children in Boston. Some scholars think that story may be apocryphal, but I think probably it's true. While the punchline of the story could have perhaps been about any major colonial town, the source of this story is Lawrence Hammond's diary, a merchant in Boston and Charlestown, from 1688. And he gives us a clue as to who the debauched gentleman was. And in the diary, he gives that man's name as initial J. Broadbent. And it didn't take much research to discover that there was a Joshua Broadbent in Boston at that time who more or less fit that description. And so it was fun to realize that there were perceptions about Boston at the time that really may give us a new perspective on the town. Another one, which I think is great fun, is one recorded in 1699 by an Englishman named Ned Johnson, who wrote a book called A Trip to New England. And some scholars think perhaps he didn't even visit Boston, but he left a wonderful and colorful, rich account of his visit to Boston, and unflatteringly described Bostonians as individuals preoccupied in detecting one another's failings, and that a meritorious Christian was one who betrays his neighbor to the whipping post. And one of my favorite tales, which is a bawdy tale, is the anecdote of two busybody deacons in Boston, mortified by the sight of a woman relieving herself in public. And the story goes like this. A couple of deacons marching along the street espied a woman in a corner relieving nature from the uneasiness of a burden she could keep no longer. One of them cried to the other, pointing to the stooping object, Brother, brother, what a shameful thing, what a beastly thing is this. I vow, brother, this is a thing that ought to be peeped into. The other, being a more sensible man, said, Pray thee, brother, do thou peep into it, then, for I care not to run such a hazard of my eyesight. Besides, he said, the thing's too deep for our inspection, and therefore we shall only be laughed at for meddling in the matter. And so that is among many of the tales that Ned Ward tells about the hypocrisy of early Boston. Again, another view into the Puritan era that we may not be aware of today. Well, why did I write this book? I had an amazing story come to my attention that really sparked the whole project, and that was when a colleague of mine from the Abbey Aldrich Rockefeller Folk Art Museum wrote to me and said, Brenton, we have a painting of a young child, the sibling of this child, and the story was that the child had been poisoned, but scholars have since shown that that didn't happen. But what did happen to the child? What can you tell me about the child, and when did she die? And I thought it was very strange that the story should surround the poisoning of the child or children of a Boston apothecary. And I thought, well, a poisoning in the family of a druggist, that sounds plausible at least. And so I started looking into it, but I found that scholars had debunked the story, and some of them had been quite adamant. Art historians and art historians both had. And a gentleman named Alfred Frankenstein had turned to Boston scholars to debunk the story, and he wrote, "A careful check of the records of the Boston Athenaeum by the historian Walter Muir Whitehill and his associates has failed to turn up anything to substantiate the story." And then Frankenstein went on to make the story, the supposed murder, an example of really bad history and bad art history. And he wrote, "It is a complete fiction, typical of the folklore that clings, especially in family traditions, to so many paintings, and makes popular art history more interesting, but considerably less reliable than the truth. Nevertheless, the realities of art history can be enormously interesting, if on a different level from the blood and guts of the Greenleaf story." Well, to make a long story short, I looked into the story and debunked the debunking. This murder did take place, and in fact it is the first multiple murder of its kind in Boston, and I tell that whole story in the book. And sadly, the 3 children were killed. This is a painting by John Singleton Copley of John Greenleaf Jr. And it was very interesting. The way Boston dealt with this at the time in the newspapers was to treat it very telegraphically, almost no news, whereas today this would be sensational news, and we would have endless reports on it. But that was not how Boston responded, at least in the mid-19th century, to this sort of tale. And it got me thinking, if Boston has debunked or forgotten about its first murder case like this, what else doesn't it know? And the big story for me was that witchcraft had been so prevalent in our history, and yet Salem really has a monopoly on that story. And so what I did is I set about trying to recreate the story of Boston witchcraft and diabolical possession. One of the first things I realized was that unlike Salem, Boston's history of this phenomena lasted much longer. It began in 1638, and the last diabolical possession we know about was in 1741. So a century of this sort of activity. And what I found was that the women involved, bear with me a moment here, were often medical practitioners or women who had had difficulties in the community, had fights or disagreements, and they were often widows, and they had committed other crimes or transgressions. But principally, these were uppity women who had trouble in town and who fought with their neighbors. And John Winthrop's diary gives us the story of Jane Hawkins, a midwife who had the misfortune of delivering the Quaker Mary Dyer's deformed baby. She was banished, and then there was a period of 10 years before we had a major witchcraft trial in Boston. And in both of these stories, John Winthrop is the source. And Margaret Jones, again, was a woman who practiced medicine. In this case, she was a sort of herbalist and often helped women with pregnancies. But her treatments were said to have a malignant touch and could cause deafness and other very acute reactions. And so Winthrop catalogs all the things, sort of all the categories of witchcraft activities in which she acted, and it was also, she was threatening to her patients that if they didn't continue with her treatments, they would continue in their maladies. She could predict events, and she knew details of private conversations that she had no way of knowing. A witch's teat was discovered on her body, and perhaps most condemning, when she was jailed in Boston, an imp appeared in the cell and then later vanished. And I should mention that Margaret was jailed with her husband, Mr. Jones, and we don't know his first name. And another generalization on the witches and witchcraft suspects in Boston would be that of the female suspects, I've uncovered one of their maiden names. Every one of these women, we only know their married name. We don't know their origins. So again, it's in stark contrast to Salem, where we know quite a bit about the people. But Margaret's conviction was controversial in town, and John Hale, who later wrote a book on witchcraft, as a young man had visited her in jail, and he gave a different view of her conviction, and he said that she was convicted because, quote, some angry words had passed between her and her neighbors, and some mischief had befallen their livestock. So it shows that the perils of being a difficult woman in early Boston were quite extreme. Alice Lake was brought up on witchcraft charges 2 years later, and she is one of the most mysterious witchcraft victims, as it were. We know almost nothing about her, other than that she was thought to have, quote, played the harlot before marriage. She was promiscuous in some way. And one of the interesting things that I found was that she and her husband, Henry Lake, were actually, sometime after they married, brought up on charges before the Court of Assistants for fornication that occurred before they were married, and she was made to stand in punishment in Dorchester at the next lecture day. So again, she had transgressions of a sort. And we have another view provided by the Mathers on what really happened here, and it was a letter from Nathaniel Mather to Increase Mather a number of years later, which said, I have heard the devil drew her in the likeness and acting the part of a child of hers lately dead, on whom her heart was much set. So that's another view, another little tantalizing clue as to what might have happened. But whatever happened, she was executed, the second woman executed in Boston, and that event dismantled the remnants of her family. Her husband shot off to Rhode Island, as many of the people I write about actually flee to Rhode Island, and her children were farmed out to live in other families. Anne Hibbins is one of my favorite characters in the book, and to many of you, you may recall her from The Scarlet Letter, where Hawthorne has her as a background character in the book, and there's a famous encounter with Hester Prynne in the book. But she was a real person. She was socially prominent. Her husband was a magistrate. She was connected to Governor Bellingham through that marriage. William Hibbins had married, firstly, the sister of Governor Bellingham. Many sources call Anne the sister of the governor. That the relationship was a little more complex than that. But she'd had many troubles in town, and the catalyst for her problems was the work done by a carpenter at her house named John Crabtree, who was hired to do work for 3 shillings. And by the time he finished the work, he was charging the Hibbinses 13 pounds. And Anne was furious about this and talked all over town about how awful this was. And she was hauled in before the elders of the First Church. And fortunately, the Boston merchant, Robert Kane, kept notes on the excommunication hearings at the First Church. And here we have the rare words of a Boston witch. And one of her prophetic statements at those hearings was, "I desire you all to take notice of my fall, that you may stand." And Anne was finally tried only after her husband died. William Hibbins died in 1655, opening the door to Anne's trial as a witch. And unfortunately, in this, as in all of the other cases, the records of the court really no longer exist. So I've had to piece together the stories from other types of sources. But she was hanged at the site of the Great Elm on Boston Common. And again, there is another view on what really happened. And I'll just read you this passage, a little bit of a passage from my book. A minister wrote to Increase Mather with a view to what really happened. And he said, "You may remember what I have sometimes told you, that one of your magistrates' wives, as I remember, was hanged for a witch only for having more wit than her neighbors." And so that was another view on why she was executed. And one of the interesting things I'd note about Anne Hibbins was that she really breaks the modern stereotype of a witch as a hag with a crooked nose and riding a broomstick. Anne Hibbins was a very fashionable woman. Her estate inventory survives, and you read through very luxurious items of clothing that she had and other finery. And this is a woman who wore blue and greens and other brightly hued dresses, and was probably, in fact, too fashionable for Puritan Boston. So she's another special character. And I felt, just as an aside, I felt I came awfully close in this one to solving her identity. Her will is wonderful because she added lots of codicils to it and named many people. And she named a cousin in London who was an important figure in Cromwellian London. And I thought that that would be helpful and was really in establishing something of her background. But then you have a pause for many years before another woman is brought up, Anne Hibbins. She practiced medicine in both Lynn and Boston, and there's some really fascinating accounts of how she even performed minor surgery. This was someone who really had an interesting career as a doctoress, and she was brought up on charges by some very slimy Bostonians called the Bennets. I hope no one here is descended from them. Sorry if you are. Samuel Bennett was called by a contemporary the veriest rascal in New England. And what Anne and her husband did was quite clever. They countersued the Bennets and accused the Bennets of causing the neglectful death of a Boston woman, and they prevailed. And Anne was acquitted. And she is said to be buried at Copp's Hill. And I searched and searched for the stone. We know it was visible in the 19th century, but I think, unfortunately, no remnant of it survives. Mary Hale was another woman accused of witchcraft in Boston. And she's another favorite. She had problems in town, and as you can see here, she was sued for striking a woman and using all kinds of choice expletives on Alice McDaniel and her husband. And again, practiced medicine, had a boarding house in town. And what happened, the genesis of the witchcraft case here was that she had a granddaughter living with her, a 16-year-old girl, and Joanna. And Joanna was being courted by a mariner named Michael Smith, and the courtship didn't work out. Joanna was not very interested in Michael, but Mary Hale was upset about that breakup and wanted the couple to stay together. and then started doing all kinds of creepy things, creeping around and eavesdropping at Michael Smith's window. And when Michael found a new girlfriend, Mary was especially upset. And before long, Michael fell into a sort of diabolical possession and was claiming that Mary Hale had bewitched him. And he even claimed that she had transported him, maybe by broomstick, to Dorchester, where he witnessed a coven of witches drinking wine, and he told this tale and then promptly died. And so Mary was hauled in on witchcraft charges, and you have this very interesting urine test where, and there were many different types of tests for witchcraft, but this is the only time I've seen this one, where they had taken a sample of Michael Smith's urine and put it in a bottle, and when Mary was present near the bottle, she was terribly agitated, and then when they uncorked the bottle later, she calmed down. And to the women of 17th century Boston, that was a surefire sign of witchcraft. Amazing to think about it. But Mary was eventually acquitted, and one of her significant contributions to witchcraft history, and this really had not been very well examined, was that she was the matriarch of 3 generations of witchcraft suspects. And her daughter Winifred Benham and granddaughter Winifred Benham Jr. were also hauled in for witchcraft in Connecticut on charges some years later, and like their mother and grandmother, eventually were acquitted. Mrs. D is, I think this is a wonderful tale, provided to us by an itinerant bookseller, John Dunton, who came to Boston with all kinds of tales about, again, characterizing Bostonians in ways perhaps you've never heard before. But he told the story of Mrs. D. We don't know her name or if she really existed, because he was prone to plagiarizing from other sources. But I've found that many of his stories actually hold up, and I would be curious to know someday if we could identify Mrs. D. But she had a bad face, worse tongue, and the report of a witch. And let me just read you a little passage of one of her magic tricks that astounded Bostonians. Dunton said, "Whether she be one," meaning a witch, "or not, I know not, but she has ignorance and malice enough to make her one. And indeed she has done very odd things, but hitherto as are rather strange than hurtful. Yea, some of them are pretty and pleasing, but such as I think cannot be done without the help of the devil. For instance, she will take 9 sticks, lay them across, and by mumbling a few words make them stand up on end like a pair of 9-pins. But she best have a care, for they that use the devil's help to make sport may quickly come to do mischief." So that is the tale of Mrs. D. Again, we'd love to know if she was real, but we don't. Mary Glover was the 4th and final woman executed in Boston for witchcraft, and this case involved the possession of 4 children in the Goodwin family, and it all sprang about as a result of young Martha Goodwin, a teenage girl in that family, suspecting that some linens were missing, maybe from the clothesline, and she fingered Mary's daughter, who was their laundress, as the culprit. And Mary was really angry about that and would have nothing to do with it and started doing strange things. And before long, all 4 of the Goodwin children fell into abnormal behaviors. They were seen flying across rooms and screaming in strange ways, and their heads would spin around. And Cotton Mather is the source for some of that color and gives us wonderful descriptions of it. But by all accounts, Mary Glover did do some strange things, and one of them was that she carried a stone around with her, a long, slender stone, and she would lick her finger and run it down the stone and mumble strange words, and that would send the Goodwin children into just spasms of wild behavior. And so she was actually examined by physicians to see if she was insane. They judged her to be sane, and eventually she was tried and executed. And that closed the period of witchcraft for convictions, at any rate, but opened a slightly new phenomenon, which was the diabolical possession, where no witch was fingered, but someone fell into diabolical fits, was possessed by the devil, and Mercy Short was the first of these. Here is the first and really only meeting between the Salem witchcraft trials and the Boston witchcraft incidents. Mercy was sent on an errand to the Boston jail where Sarah Good, who was a tried and convicted Salem witch, was being housed, and the two of them had a fight, and I described that in the book. And very soon thereafter, Mercy fell into diabolical fits and was brought back to health by Cotton Mather, and disappeared into obscurity like so many of these people afterwards. But she sparked another possession, which occurred the following year when Margaret Rule also fell into a similar set of fits, and Cotton Mather again was brought in to take a look, and was, according to some Bostonians, agitating to create another climate of witchcraft fear, such as had occurred in Salem. And one of the remarkable things in Margaret Rule's case is that she was seen to levitate in midair, and respectable Bostonians swore to some of these very colorful events. And let me just read you a passage given to us from Samuel Avis, who witnessed Margaret levitating in midair. And he says, "I do testify that I have seen Margaret Rule in her afflictions from the invisible world, lifted up from her bed, wholly by an invisible force, a great way towards the top of the room where she lay. In her being so lifted, she had no assistance from any use of her own arms or hands, or any part of her body, not so much as her heels touching the bed or resting on any support whatsoever. And I have seen her thus lifted, when not only a strong man hath thrown his whole weight across her to pull her down, but several other persons have endeavored with all their might to hinder her from being so raised up, which I suppose that several others will testify as well as myself, and several others did." And like Mercy Short, who preceded her, Margaret eventually returned to normality and drifted into obscurity like so many of the other women. Elizabeth Prout was someone, again, we know very little about, and I won't spend much time on this, other than Samuel Sewell, who had been involved in the Salem trials, said in his diary one day in 1694, "Mrs. Prout dies after sore conflicts of mind, not without suspicion of witchcraft." And with that tantalizing clue, we know nothing more about what befell Mrs. Prout. But the story I'll end the witchcraft on is Martha Robinson. And you can see here that there was a pause of 50 years before this occurred in Boston. And what happened here was a diabolical possession that scared Boston. It scared the ministers of Boston. And this young woman, again a teenage young lady, had fallen into fits after attending a sermon by an itinerant minister, Gilbert Tennant, and really scared the wits out of everyone, and an exorcism was performed, which is the only occurrence of that I can find in colonial Boston, and omens were said to occur, strange gusts of wind and other strange happenings. And this story was recorded by a visitor from Hartford who came and was brought into Martha's house and witnessed this and left us a wonderful first-hand account of a diabolical possession. And with that, the chapter of witchcraft and possession closed. But while I won't have time to go into other sections of the book, I had a lot of fun putting together other types of tales. I didn't just want to do witchcraft. I wanted to tell stories of rogues and impostors who came to town and swindled the leading merchants and the Brahmins of town, and also unusual crimes, kidnapping of heiresses, extortion attempts, bigamy, all kinds of tales, again, that change our perception of early Boston. When I hear people say nothing happened here before the Revolution, it really gets my back up, because I think there was an awful lot of interesting history. And one of the tales that I tell was provided by a parishioner of the Old South Meeting House, and I'll just end on this. Anna Green Winslow was a young lady who witnessed scandal, and in her diary she recorded the tale of Elizabeth Smith, Betty Smith in the diary. And Betty Smith's story, Betty was really a career criminal in town, and would go around pleading poverty and being allowed to stay in people's houses and then leaving the next morning in a clandestine manner with huge bags of clothing and other household possessions. And she went around town doing this, and Betty, young Anna Green Winslow, was scandalized just as everyone was. And this was the backdrop of this story, was in the months after the Boston Massacre. And clearly Anna, from her diary, she knew Betty Smith, and her family knew Betty Smith. And Betty was brought, like so many people, to the gallows and punished. And in her case, because she had multiple convictions, she was actually made to stand on the gallows with a noose around her neck, which was one step short of being hanged. But like so many of the culprits I write about in my book, they were subjected to street punishment in Boston. I'll just read you this last description of what punishment was like in Boston in the 18th century. And this comes from the memoirs of Samuel Breck. The large whipping post, painted red, stood conspicuously and permanently in the most public street in town. It was placed in State Street, directly under the windows of a great writing school, which I frequented, and from them the scholars were indulged in the spectacle of all kinds of punishment, suited to harden their hearts and brutalize their feelings. Here women were taken from a huge cage in which they were dragged on wheels from prison, and tied to the whipping post with bare backs, on which 30 or 40 lashes were bestowed amid the screams of the culprits and the uproar of the mob. A little further in the street was to be seen the pillory, with 3 or 4 fellows fastened by the head and hands, and standing for an hour in that helpless posture, exposed to gross and cruel insult from the multitude, who pelted them incessantly with rotten eggs and every repulsive kind of garbage that could be collected. These things I have often witnessed, but they have given way to better systems, better manners, and better feelings. Thank you. I think we have time for a few questions. Yes?
I found your talk very interesting, and I was particularly intrigued by your reference to the method of dispatch of the witches. On several occasions you talked about hangings and the gallows. I suppose the popular belief was that many of the witches were dispatched by burning at the stake. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about
Sure.
The method of execution and how society decided on which.
Sure. Well, in Boston, there was I could not find evidence of burning, but I have to say that in so many of these cases, we don't know. The actual conviction record does not survive, and so we don't know much about the punishments. The firmest case for how someone was executed, at least in the witchcraft period, was Anne Hibbins, who it was generally said that she was hanged from a branch of the great elm. And so scholars have supposed that that was the method used in most cases. And in fact, there is a little tidbit for a conviction record in her case where it says she was to be hanged. So we can suppose that the Court of Assistants used that punishment in most cases. So I really didn't find cases of burning or other more severe types of execution, if you will. In other crimes, there were a variety of types of punishment, and the punishment was suited to match the crime. And throughout the book, there are examples of that. And often, you were made to sit in the town square with a big placard on your chest, like akin to the Scarlet Letter, if you will. And one of my favorites was a woman who had robbed several merchants, and hers said, "A cheat," in capital letters across her placard. There was a woman who I write about, Ruth Reed, who was convicted of having an affair and actually entering into a bigamous union in England. And hers was to say something about her whorish carriage, and she had the choice of taking that punishment in front of everyone in town or being banished, and she chose banishment. And that was a rare case of where someone was actually given a choice of punishment.
One reason why I'm looking forward to reading your book is that it does get into the earthy and gritty side of the city that, as you noted, doesn't get into many of the other mainstream histories of the city. Why do you think these kinds of stories have not appeared in those mainstream treatments, unlike some of the histories you can read about cities like London and Chicago and New York, where they sort of get into that on-the-street level
Sure.
of life in those cities?
Well, that's a great question, and that goes to the root of why I wrote this book. I was amazed to discover that, too, and that really we have this rich Revolutionary War history here, and I think it really overshadows the colonial period. And so I felt I was digging up some of these stories, and in fact many of them have just never been published or told before. And then there is that strange perception of Boston as a prim and proper town where Puritans were in charge, and so it was a town under strict control, and this sort of deviance didn't take place. And so we may be battling a couple of perception issues that have clouded the early history from being as clearly presented as it might be.
I have either heard or read in the past that one of the tests for whether someone was a witch was to submerge them in water, perhaps in some sort of contraption that trapped them. And if they floated, they were a witch, therefore
Right.
they were guilty. If they sank and drowned, they were innocent. But this seems to me like a lose-lose proposition. And I don't know, is this just purely apocryphal, or did tests like that
was
take
called
place?
that existed. That was called the dunking test, and I think that Mary Hale's daughter and granddaughter, who I mentioned, I think in Connecticut, were subjected to that particular test. I didn't find examples of it in Boston, but I read you that list of characteristics for when Margaret Jones was convicted of witchcraft, and really any one of those might have been enough to convict someone. So there were both, observing the suspect as well as subjecting them to tests. And the strangest one, as I said, was the one done with Mary Hale, where I'd never read anything like that before.
I wondered whether the people accused had an opportunity to defend themselves during this procedure, and also whether there were any indications why these individuals were chosen. I assume they were all women, from what you've said.
They were all women. There were a couple of men at the time of the Salem trials, John Alden Jr. and other people. I didn't go into that because they're really, although they were connected to Boston, they were associated with the Salem trials. Mr. Jones, the husband of Margaret Jones, was suspected, but otherwise they were women, and it really boils down to the characteristics I mentioned at the beginning. These were women who were having difficulties in the community. They were more often than not medical practitioners, and there was something about that clearly upset the Puritan hierarchy. And they were often widows, or there were passive husbands in the background. And so we don't know really what the catalyst in every case was for the charges, but there's an obvious retribution aspect to it that you don't really see as clearly, say, in Salem.
You used the word imp as
yes.
An imp was seen in the room. What
yes.
exactly does that
mean?
mean?
Well, an imp would have been a small spirit of a child, a small, almost like an imaginary spirit, and it would have. They were often seen in conjunction with these charges. In the case of Mary Glover, there was a little blue or black creature was seen at night, and that may have been an imp. And so they were, to our minds, an imaginary, like a troll or a dwarf of some kind.
I was just surprised to see that some were acquitted, because I'd heard that other story too. I didn't think you ever got acquitted.
Yes, and that's the tragedy of not having the full record, because we'd love to know what evidence helped to get some people off. In some cases, these were women like Ann Hibbins very nearly got off. The case was tried more than once, and she had some of the most prominent Bostonians were among her supporters. And so you don't know who intervened behind the scenes and helped people to escape conviction. Sometimes the cases were simply dismissed for lack of evidence.
One more back here? All right, one more.
Hi, I'm from Cumberland, Maryland. Between 1775 and 9/11, what would have been one of the most notorious acts of witchcraft coming from Boston?
I did not do that period at all, so I'm going to have to dodge that question. I really worked up to the point of the revolution and stopped, but maybe there'll be a sequel. But thank you. I'm going to be available if you're interested in having the book yourself or giving it as a gift. I'll be here to sign for a few minutes. And I must thank my employer, the New England Historic Genealogical Society. I brought brochures for the society. If you're interested in family history, and I hope you are, please come by our building at 99101 Newbury Street. We also have a website, newenglandancestors.org, and we're there to help you with family or local history, and we'd love to do that. Thank you so much.
Thank you to Mr. Simons, and thank you all for coming today. And again, this is a great book. You can tell the kids tales tonight when they come to your doors for candy about all the great stories of Boston. And I hope that we'll see some of you back here on Thursday for Mitchell Zuckoff talking about Charles Ponzi. Thanks, and have a lovely afternoon.